You laugh at the table. You say the right things. You are, by every visible measure, exactly who you are supposed to be. And then you get into the car, and the silence feels heavier than it should. There is a particular kind of loneliness that no one talks about, because from the outside, it makes no sense. It belongs to the person who is impressive in public, and strangely absent in private. The one who can solve problems for everyone else, but cannot locate their own desire. You achieve the thing. You receive the praise. And almost immediately, it evaporates. Not because it wasn't enough, but because it never quite touched you. This is not the loneliness of isolation. It is something quieter, more disorienting. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who admire a version of you that you no longer, perhaps never, truly inhabited. If you are here, there is a good chance you are intelligent, capable, functional, the kind of person others rely on. And yet, beneath that competence, something doesn't feel entirely real, not dramatic, not broken, just slightly out of place. As if your life is happening a few inches in front of you, and you are watching it from behind glass. Today, we are not going to fix that feeling. We are going to look at it directly, honestly, without softening it into something comfortable. Because there is a possibility, an uncomfortable one, that the very traits that made you successful, your intelligence, your adaptability, your ability to become what was needed, are the same traits that slowly, quietly disconnected you from yourself. This is the story of the persona, the mask that works so well, you forgot it was a mask. It did not begin as deception. That is the first thing to understand. The persona, the polished, capable, high-functioning identity that you present to the world, was not originally a lie. It was an answer, a response to something real, something that the child or young person you once were needed to navigate in order to feel safe, accepted, or worthy of love. Carl Jung described the persona as the mask we wear in social life, the face we construct to meet the world's expectations. He borrowed the term from ancient Greek theater, where actors literally wore masks to signal their role. What Jung understood, with a clarity that still cuts, is that every human being develops a persona. It is not pathological. It is, in fact, necessary. You cannot move through social life without some carefully curated version of yourself. The question is not whether you have a persona. The question is whether you still know who you are beneath it. For intelligent people, this process begins unusually early, and it goes unusually deep. Intelligent children are perceptive children. They read rooms. They sense tension before anyone has spoken a word. They notice the subtle shift in a parent's expression, the particular quality of silence after a disappointment, the way warmth is given more freely when they perform well, academically, socially, emotionally. And because they are intelligent, they adapt quickly. They learn with extraordinary precision what works. What works often is being capable, being useful, being the one who does not cause problems, being impressive. There is nothing inherently wrong with any of those things. The tragedy is not in the capabilities themselves. It is in the moment the child begins to experience those capabilities not as expressions of who they are, but as conditions for being loved. The moment competence stops being natural and starts being strategic. The moment the child learns that the easiest path to emotional safety is to become whatever the room requires. This is how the mask is forged, not in cruelty, but in intelligence deployed in the service of survival. And once it is made, it is remarkably effective. The intelligent child who learned to perform competence grows into the adult who is genuinely competent. The adaptability that was once emotional armor becomes actual skill. The emotional suppression that once protected against vulnerability becomes the ability to remain calm under pressure, which is, in professional life, enormously rewarded. The tragedy of the high-functioning person is that their wound becomes their credential. Think about perfectionism for a moment, not the cartoon version, the procrastinating notebook organizing kind that gets joked about in job interviews. The real thing, the deep, anxious, relentless kind. That particular brand of perfectionism in most high-achieving people is not ambition. It is not a love of excellence. It is terror. It is the residue of having learned at some formative moment that mistakes are not just inconvenient, they are dangerous. That being wrong, being sufficient, being less than impressive carries a social cost that feels, at a nervous system level, unbearable. Perfectionism is the persona's immune response to vulnerability and praise addiction. The quiet compulsion to achieve not because the work itself is meaningful, but because the external validation feels like oxygen. This too is the persona's architecture. The high achiever who cannot stop working, cannot accept compliments without immediately minimizing them, cannot sit with a completed project without already anxious about the next. They are not greedy for success. They are desperate for the feeling that success temporarily produces, the sensation that they are enough, that the mask is secure, that no one has looked underneath. The mask worked. That is the point. For years, perhaps decades, it worked magnificently. Career success, social credibility, the ability to move through the world with apparent ease. People looked at you and saw capability. They looked at you and felt reassured. And there was something in that, a genuine satisfaction, a real if incomplete sense of worth. But the mask kept working long after the original crisis had passed, long after the childhood that necessitated it had ended. And somewhere in the distance between who you learn to be and who you actually are, a gap opened, slowly, quietly, imperceptibly. And in that gap, the true self began to starve. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with achieving something you worked toward for years and feeling, upon arrival, almost nothing. Not disappointment, exactly. Not cynicism. Something more confusing, a flatness. A hollowness where the feeling should be. You stand at the summit you spent years climbing and discover that the view, though technically impressive, does not move you. And the most unsettling part is not the absence of joy. It is the absence of surprise at the absence of joy. Some part of you already knew. This is one of the most reliable and most carefully suppressed experiences in the lives of high-functioning people. The promotion that doesn't land. The relationship that looks right on paper but feels oddly distant. The life that is, by every legible metric, a success. And the strange, private grief of living inside it and feeling somehow peripheral to your own existence. Philosophers sometimes call this a crisis of meaning. Psychologists reach for words like anhedonia or dissociation. But I think the most honest description is simpler and more damning. You won the wrong game. Not because the game was worthless, but because you designed your life, unconsciously, around the needs of the persona rather than the needs of the self. You built a life that impressed. You built a life that was safe. You built a life optimized for the approval of others, or for the avoidance of the specific variety of pain you learned to fear in childhood. And that life is real. The achievements are real. The competence is real. But none of it was built around the question of what would make you feel alive. Because the persona, by its very nature, is not interested in aliveness. It is interested in security, in legibility, in the management of how you are perceived. It will happily sacrifice depth for stability, sacrifice passion for respectability, sacrifice the unpredictable electricity of genuine desire for the smooth, controllable surface of a life that makes sense to other people. And so the high-functioning person finds themselves, often in their 30s or 40s, though sometimes younger, sometimes much later, living on a kind of autopilot. They do the work. They maintain the relationships. They perform the correct emotional responses at the correct social moments. But there is something mechanical about it now. The lights are on, but the inhabitant has quietly retreated. This manifests differently in different people. For some, it is chronic numbness, an inability to feel things that should, by all rights, be felt. Excitement that has been replaced by mild interest. Love that is present but somehow held at arm's length. Beauty that registers intellectually without landing emotionally. The world continues to happen. You continue to respond to it, but the responses feel curated rather than real, performed rather than experienced. For others, it is a subtle but persistent loneliness, not from lack of company, but from the particular loneliness of never being fully known. Because the persona is excellent at connection of a certain kind. It is charming, or at least pleasant. It asks the right questions. It mirrors the right things. It creates the impression of intimacy without the vulnerability that intimacy actually requires. And so the high-functioning person can move through a full social life, friends, colleagues, a partner, and still feel in the most private part of themselves, unseen. There is also the inability to rest. This one is underestimated. The persona requires maintenance. It is a performance, and performances demand energy. But the deeper reason high-functioning people cannot truly rest is that stillness is threatening. Because in stillness, in the genuine quiet between one task and the next, the self that has been suppressed begins to make itself heard. Vague restlessness, unnamed longing, questions that don't have tidy answers. The persona responds to this the way a nervous system responds to threat, with motion, with productivity, with the next project, the next goal, the next thing to be competent at. As long as you are moving, you do not have to hear what the silence is trying to say. And underneath all of this numbness, this loneliness, this compulsive forward motion, there is something that most high-achieving people will not name even to themselves. The feeling that their life, for all its accomplishments, has not yet really begun. That somewhere in the careful architecture of all this success, the actual person got left behind. Jung had a concept he called the shadow. Not the dramatic villain shadow of popular metaphor, not the simple repository of evil or darkness. Something far more interesting, and in many ways far more threatening to the persona than any darkness could be. The shadow, in Jung's understanding, is everything the persona refuses to be. Everything the carefully constructed social self cannot accommodate, will not express, has learned to disown. For highly intelligent, high-achieving, emotionally controlled people, the shadow is often not monstrous at all. It is surprisingly tender. It contains the parts of themselves that were never safe to show. The person who wants to rest without justification, who wants to create without it having to be impressive, who wants to love without managing the relationship from a strategic distance, who wants to feel things fully rather than processing them quickly and moving on. It contains buried desires, sometimes small, sometimes enormous. The unlived version of the self that had to be set aside in service of the persona's demands. Jung believed, and this is the insight that, once understood, reframes everything, that the psyche tends toward wholeness, not happiness, not success, wholeness. And if the persona becomes too dominant, if the gap between the mask and the true self grows too wide and too sustained, the psyche will eventually revolt, not politely, not at a convenient moment. It will force a reckoning. This is why burnout in genuinely high-functioning people rarely looks like laziness or weakness. It looks like a system failure, a sudden inability to do the things that were, until recently, executed with apparent ease. The brilliant executive who cannot get out of bed. The relentlessly productive writer who cannot produce a sentence. The composed, capable person who, seemingly without warning, begins to cry in their car and cannot precisely explain why. This is not breakdown. Or rather, it is not only breakdown. It is, in the most precise psychological sense, the self-refusing further betrayal. Anxiety, in this framework, takes on a different meaning. For the high-functioning person, anxiety is often not about the things it appears to be about. The deadlines, the presentations, the fear of failure. Those are real, but they are proxies. What is actually producing the anxiety is the growing distance between who they are, performing themselves to be, and who they actually are. The nervous system senses the inauthenticity, even when the conscious mind has learned to stop questioning it. And it responds with alarm, because at some deep biological level, pretending to be someone you are not is experienced as threat, as the loss of self, which, in a very real sense, is exactly what it is. Identity crisis. 2. Those destabilizing moments where previously settled beliefs about who you are suddenly feel hollow or fraudulent. These are not evidence of instability. They are, typically, evidence of the shadow breaking through the persona's surface. The sudden sense that the life you have built doesn't fit. The inexplicable attraction to a completely different way of living. The irrational urge to abandon what you've carefully constructed and begin again with something more honest, even if you cannot name what that is. Irrational urges are often the truest things in a person's psychology. The psyche speaks in them when the conscious mind has become too defended to listen to anything subtler. What is essential to understand, and this requires sitting with for a moment, is that the emptiness you feel is not a malfunction. It is not evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you, that you are broken in ways others are not, that you failed to arrive at the contentment that other people apparently feel. The emptiness is signal. It is the psyche communicating with increasing urgency that the current arrangement is not sustainable, that the persona has been fed at the expense of the self for too long, that the unlived life is not simply going to disappear. Your emptiness is not failure. It is loyalty to the part of you that has not yet been given permission to exist. Here is what no one tells you about authenticity. It is not, in the beginning, a relief. It is terrifying. The self-help industry has largely reduced the concept to something pleasant. Become your authentic self. Live your truth. As though the process were simply a matter of permission. As though you were always free and just needed to be reminded. But for someone who has spent years, perhaps their entire adult life, inhabiting a persona that others depend upon, that others admire, that others have organized their expectations around, the prospect of shedding it is not liberation. Not at first. It is grief. It is danger. It is the specific vertigo of not knowing who you would be if you stopped performing who you were. There is a fear, often unspoken, of becoming ordinary. The persona carries a kind of distinction. It is impressive, or at least reliable, or at least useful. To dismantle it is to risk losing the quality that made you feel, even if falsely, secure in the world's regard. What if, without the performance, there is nothing particularly remarkable underneath? What if the real you is disappointingly unremarkable? What if the people who admired you stop? There is another fear that runs alongside this. The fear of disappointing others. Because the persona was built, in part, around others' needs. The parents who needed you to be capable. The partners who needed you to be stable. The colleagues who needed you to be dependable. The audience, in whatever form it took, who needed you to be impressive. To step out of that role is to risk a particular kind of abandonment. To discover that the love and approval you received was conditional not on you, but on the performance. And for someone who spent their early life learning to earn love through performance, that discovery, however necessary, is devastating. And then there is the deepest fear of all, the one that sits beneath the others and is almost never examined directly. The fear of losing your own identity. Because the persona, however false, is familiar. It is the only version of yourself you have known how to be for so long that dismantling it raises an existential question. Not just, who will I become, but who am I at all? The persona became so thoroughly the architecture of your self-concept that there is no clear image of the self beneath it. And to step away from it is to step into a space that feels genuinely like formlessness. This is the grief of the false self, and it is real grief. It deserves to be named as such. The mourning of the admired version of yourself is not self-pity. It is the legitimate sorrow of releasing an identity that, for all its falseness, also carried you, that protected you, that worked in its own limited way for a very long time. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. He did not say it was easy. He did not say it was pleasant. He understood that the process of individuation, his word for the lifelong movement toward psychological wholeness, is often painful, disorienting, and profoundly lonely in its early stages. Because you are moving away from the familiar, away from the approval of the crowd, away from the person others needed you to be, and towards something that has not yet fully taken shape. But here is what is also true. The self, the deeper, more authentic core of who you are, does not require you to be extraordinary to justify its existence. It does not require you to perform. It does not require a specific kind of success or a particular level of impressiveness. The self simply wants to be lived. It wants genuine curiosity instead of curated interest. It wants actual rest instead of earned rest. It wants to love without managing the emotional distance. It wants to create without it having to be admired. It wants to feel the full texture of experience rather than processing it from behind the glass of the persona. Psychological wholeness does not mean the destruction of competence or the abandonment of ambition. It means that the competent, ambitious self is no longer the only self permitted to exist. It means there is room, finally, for the parts of you that the persona could not accommodate. The tender, uncertain, genuinely feeling person who has been living in the shadow of their own mask. Becoming real is not the end of who you are. It is, after all this time, the beginning. There is a moment. It comes differently for different people, but almost everyone who has lived inside a persona for long enough eventually encounters it, where you catch yourself. Mid-performance, mid-sentence, mid-achievement, a strange, still moment of double vision, where you are watching yourself from outside and what you see is not entirely who you are. That moment is not a crisis, even if it feels like one. It is the self, knocking. It is the part of you that was never lost, only submerged. Only asked to wait while the persona handled things. And however frightening it is to hear it, however destabilizing it feels to acknowledge it, that knock is the most important sound in a person's psychological life. The intelligence that built your mask is the same intelligence that can dismantle it, carefully, honestly, without destroying yourself in the process. The adaptability that made you so skilled at becoming what others needed is the same adaptability that can learn, however late, to ask what you need. The emotional sensitivity you learned to suppress did not disappear. It went underground, and it has been waiting. Not every unlived desire can or should be reclaimed. Not every buried impulse deserves expression. This is not an invitation to blow up your life in the name of authenticity. That is simply the persona trading one performance for another. The responsible achiever replacing themselves with the liberated rebel, which is still a character, still a mask. Genuine wholeness is quieter and stranger than that. It is less a dramatic transformation than a slow, patient learning to include yourself in your own life. To let yourself be known, at least a little. To want things without apology. To feel what you feel rather than immediately converting it into something manageable. It is, in the end, the most ordinary and the most radical thing a high-functioning person can do. You were never empty. That is the thing I most want to leave you with. The numbness, the disconnection, the hollow feeling in the middle of a life that looks, from the outside, like success. None of it was emptiness. It was the cost of a bargain you made very young, when you did not fully understand the terms. You traded aliveness for safety, authenticity for approval, the unmediated experience of being yourself for the considerably more reliable reward of being impressive. It was an intelligent bargain. Given what you knew, given what you needed, it may even have been the right one. But you are no longer the child who made it. And the life you are living now is not a waiting room. It is the only one you have. The mask worked brilliantly for a long time. But underneath it, in the place that was sealed and protected and kept perfectly still while the performance continued above, you were always there. Not absent, not lost. Not emptied out by circumstances or by failure or by some fundamental flaw in your nature. Just waiting with the particular patience of things that are real for someone to finally stop performing long enough to come home.